Now, I wanted to ask you all about what your thoughts are about this. Could the Ukraine situation, this conflict, lead to nuclear war? Really? Is this, I've been hearing your coverage about this as being essentially propaganda, fear mongering. But I want to know about what the likelihood of this is, because, it's not like Vladimir Putin doesn't talk about it. There is a nuclear doctrine. Russia has a nuclear policy. But it seems to be much different than what the collective West has to say about it. So I wanted to get your thoughts about that.
Okay, should I just start? Let me just start. I mean, first of all, I think the point to understand, the first point to understand is that the Russians have repeatedly ruled out use of nuclear weapons over the course of this special military operation in Ukraine, except in specific circumstances. And that would be basically if the NATO powers became directly involved. In other words, if NATO troops entered Ukraine, started fighting Russian troops, and as the Russian senior official and politician Dmitry Medvedev, who's Putin's deputy, chairing what's called the Security Council, which is the top decision-making body in Russia, by the way. It's not just, doesn't just deal with defense policy, but as Medvedev has explained, if there was that kind of confrontation and Russia's very existence as a state was threatened, in that kind of situation, and in that alone, the Russians might feel obligated to use nuclear weapons, but that is the only circumstance in which they would do so. So there is no plan by the Russians to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That is not their intention. Why would they need to? I mean, they have far more powerful conventional forces than Ukraine has. Ultimately, as I said, I'm convinced they believe they will win, and I'm convinced they will eventually win if it comes down to a war which is dictated, the outcome of which is dictated by military means. So they don't need to use nuclear weapons. What has been happening, however, is that this scarecrow of the Russians using nuclear weapons is being constantly floated. And though I think it is originally a propaganda thing, simply floating that idea at all, the idea that there is a possibility that nuclear weapons might be used, even if it's done as a pure propaganda meme, is incredibly dangerous, because it does get into people's mind the possibility that nuclear weapons could be used and that it might even be possible to do so. Now that crosses a red line. It breaks a taboo that has existed ever since the end of the Second World War. And I think all this harping on about the Russians planning to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I think it is dangerous and irresponsible. And whilst I don't think that the United States at the moment has any plans to use nuclear weapons, I'm afraid it brings closer, every time this kind of story circulates, it brings closer the possibility that they might be used. I don't think we are there or anywhere close to being there, but I'm just absolutely horrified that this kind of debate, that this kind of discussion is happening at all.
Yeah, it's absolutely reckless, and there's a reason why they're doing it, and I think a lot of it is about media spin, because when they throw out the narrative that Putin is going to use nuclear weapons, it's done so that they can present the picture of some sort of desperate, helpless Putin who has no other options left. His economy is in tatters. He's using chips from dishwashers to power up his fighter jets. His military is collapsing. His country's falling apart. What's he going to do? What's he left with? The only thing he can do is press that button and launch the nukes. That's why they keep on going on and on about it, because it underpins the media narrative that Russia is falling apart, that Ukraine is winning, and send more money, send more weapons. Don't worry, everybody, about your inflation and the lack of gasoline and petrol and heating and hot water. Don't worry about it. Just give it another month. Don't you see? He's collapsing. It's all falling apart. But we just got to be careful because he may use nuclear weapons. That's why they keep on going on and on about it, because it supports that media narrative of the crazy madman dictator. But the problem is that the more they say it, the more it might actually, something like that may actually happen. And I don't worry about it from the Russian side of things, because Putin and the Kremlin have been very clear. You know, me and Alexander, we've read Putin's speeches when he's talked about these things 100 times. Mm-hmm. There is not one part of any of his speeches where he says, we are going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He doesn't even use the word nuclear weapons. Even in that speech that he gave a couple of weeks ago, that 14-minute speech where he announced the partial mobilization, he doesn't use the word nuclear weapons. He doesn't use that word. And the speech is there. Everyone can search it. They can read it. It's on the Kremlin website. It's in English. It's not a long speech. But somehow the media twists his words around and they say, oh, look, he said he's going to use nuclear weapons. That's not what he said. And Russia has a nuclear doctrine, and that nuclear doctrine is very specific, and the Kremlin repeats what their doctrine is. They say, we have a doctrine in place. Macron the other day said that France has a doctrine in place, and that doctrine says that if nuclear weapons are used in Ukraine, France is not obligated to use nuclear weapons. That's the French doctrine. Okay, understood. So the whole nuclear weapons thing, that's being talked about not by Russia. That's being talked about by every country in the collective West. They're the ones that talk about it. But that's what worries me, is that they talk about it over and over again. And I sit there to myself and I say, God, what are these guys trying to do? I mean, I understand it's media spin, but when does the media spin turn into reality? Because for 15 years, what were we hearing about Russia? Russia is nothing but a gasoline country, a country masquerading as a gas station and stuff like that. We heard that over and over again on BBC, on CNN, on Hannity.
Joe Biden says it all the time too.
Biden said it all the time. Hannity, every show he did, Russia is a country masquerading as a gas station. John McCain would say it. Lindsey Graham would say it. All of them. And after a while, I actually think they bought into it. They started to believe it. That, yeah, we could destroy Russia in 2 weeks, no problem. Sanction them here, there, and it'll all be over. That's what I worry about with this nuclear narrative that they've got going on. You know, when you say stuff often enough, sometimes that stuff becomes reality. But I'm not worried about the Russian side. I'm worried about the other side.